South Korea has been trying to get nuclear-powered submarines for decades. The surprising part is that the United States has just agreed to help make that happen. And the moment that news broke, one big question followed. Does this put Australia's own submarine plans at risk? Because under AUKUS, Australia needs nuclear-powered subs too. Yet local production isn't expected to start until the 2040s. So Canberra will first buy a small number of American Virginia-class submarines to fill the Navy's capability gap much sooner. That's why critics of the new Korean deal are nervous. The US is already struggling to build enough submarines for its own Navy. If it now has to support South Korea as well, there may not be enough shipyard capacity, skilled workers, or regulatory bandwidth to go around. And if that's true, Australia could face even longer delays. But here's the twist. What if South Korea isn't competing with Australia? What if it's actually adding the one thing AUKUS needs most? More industrial capacity, and helping both countries get there faster. That's the case I'm going to make in this video. Let's start with what actually happened. At the end of October, Donald Trump announced that the US would, for the first time, help South Korea acquire nuclear-powered attack submarines. He went further, too, saying they wouldn't be built in Korea at all, but in Philadelphia, at the shipyard of Hanwha Ocean, the South Korean conglomerate behind many of Korea's biggest naval building programs. On first impression, that sounds like a simple story. South Korea gets nuclear subs built in America, the US industrial base gets a much-needed cash injection to make it happen, and Australia is left waiting in an even longer queue for its own nuclear subs. So you can see why a lot of people jumped straight to panic mode. If the US already can't build Virginia-class submarines fast enough for itself and AUKUS, how does assisting another nuclear submarine program help anyone? But once you dig into the details, I think the picture begins to change. Because Seoul has been very clear about one thing. Long term, it wants these submarines built in South Korea. Korean officials have quietly pushed back on the Philadelphia Forever idea. They know that Hanwha's domestic production facilities and HD Hyundai's giant complex at Ulsan are among the most efficient shipyards on Earth. They already build some of the world's most advanced conventional submarines under the KSS-3 program. Which brings us to a crucial piece almost everyone outside Korea misses. And that is the way South Korea structures its defense industry. When a Korean shipbuilder designs a warship or a submarine, it doesn't just keep the design and enjoy a monopoly. The design is handed to DARPA, the Defense Acquisition Program Administration. DARPA then does something very unusual. It licenses that design to a direct competitor and forces a lead yard, follow yard model. That's exactly what happened with the KSS-3 submarines. Hanwha built the first boats, HD Hyundai built the next. They share the same supply chain, they both keep the skills, and the country maintains the ability to build two submarines at once at two different yards. Now, project that forward to nuclear propulsion. Even if the first Korean nuclear submarines touch steel in Philadelphia for political reasons, to show investment in American jobs and shipbuilding, that DARPA model makes it very likely that follow-on boats will be built domestically in Korea by the country's two leading shipyards. So instead of a single American yard slowly grinding out Korean submarines, what you get is something else. US-derived nuclear propulsion and technology at the core, Korean hull design and shipbuilding wrapped around it, and over time, two Korean yards that understand and sustain that technology. Why does that matter for AUKUS? Because the single biggest problem facing AUKUS right now is not political will or even money, it's industrial capacity. The US has two nuclear submarine yards. Both are completely maxed out. They are trying to build Virginia-class boats, deliver the new Columbia-class ballistic missile submarines, and keep the existing fleet running. This is where South Korea's deal becomes more interesting. To unlock US help on nuclear propulsion, Seoul has effectively agreed to pour money into the same industrial base that AUKUS depends on. Hanwha's investment in Philadelphia isn't just a vanity project, it is part of a much larger package of Korean capital going into US shipbuilding. Billions of dollars to modernize facilities, train workforces, and create what is in effect a third major nuclear-capable yard over time. Even if Philadelphia never ends up building an Australian submarine, that investment matters. It means more dry docks, more people trained on nuclear work, more supply chain depth, and more capacity for maintenance and refit. In other words, it starts to relieve the very industrial pressure that has been suffocating AUKUS from day one. So, when you see the headline, Korea gets US nuclear submarines, there's a second line underneath it that doesn't fit easily into the narrative. That is, Korea also helps pay to expand the factory everyone else needs. But the story doesn't stop in the US. Let's come back to Australia and more specifically to Henderson in Western Australia. Canberra's plan is to turn Henderson into a major naval and submarine precinct, a place that can dock and sustain future nuclear-powered boats, build surface ships, and act to complement HMAS Sterling. The rough price tag over a decade is around 25 billion Australian dollars. The federal government has put 12 billion on the table to develop the facility, leaving a $13 billion gap to be filled by private investment. In other words, by companies with deep pockets and a serious interest in naval work. Now look at who is already circling. Hanwha has taken a strategic stake in Austal, the Australian shipbuilder with major operations at Henderson, and has signaled that it wants to increase that stake. HD Hyundai has announced a multi-billion-dollar maritime investment program and is openly interested in the Australian and New Zealand naval markets. Put those threads together and you can see the outline of a bigger story. Korean money helping to upgrade US shipyards, Korean money potentially flowing into Australian yards, and all of it anchored around overlapping US-derived submarine technology. At that point, the question stops being, is Korea undermining the AUKUS timeline, and becomes, how do Australia and Korea use this to their advantage? If we fast forward to the late 2030s, Australia is going to be operating a mix of US and AUKUS-derived nuclear boats. South Korea is operating its own nuclear submarines built domestically, but with American reactors and combat systems. Both countries have yards that understand parts of the same technology stack. Both are plugged into the same US-centric supply chains. In that world, it is not hard to imagine Australian facilities at Henderson helping to sustain Korean submarines operating in the Indian Ocean, or Korean yards taking on heavy work for an Australian boat that needs deeper maintenance while deployed in North Asia.